Hi, this is Martin, and I'd like to cover a subject that, in one sense, we're all very, very interested in, and another one that probably has generally not been covered as a unique subject in and by itself, and that is basically food in the Bible. I'd like to start with probably the very beginnings and the obvious ones. The first mention of food is obviously in Genesis, Adam and Eve, and the request by the Lord not to eat of the fruit from the center of the garden, fruit of good and evil. From there, though, I would like to move to probably the next mention of food, and that is with Abraham, and he has 3 visitors. They could be angels, but they're walking towards his tent, and he invites them to stay, to be with them, and to take some time and be refreshed. So he makes it a point to bring water to them, to wash their feet and their hands. And then he goes into Sarah and asks her to use 3 measures of the finest flour that they have to make cakes, and also curds and milk. And he prepares a calf that was already, taken care of. But he wanted the meal to be very special for these travelers. It's interesting, at the end of their particular dinner, the 3 travelers, the angels, mentioned to Sarah and to Abraham that they will be coming back in a period of time, and that Sarah will be giving birth at that time. And she, from their tent, kind of chuckles and laughs, not believing this. And obviously what they're forecasting is the birth of Isaac. Going further into Genesis, basically chapter 41, Joseph, the son of Jacob, has forecasted that there will be 7 years of feasting in all of Egypt. And then it's followed by 7 years of famine. But Joseph has the whole concept taken care of, and he storehouses the wheat during the good years for the succeeding years that are to come. And by doing that, Egypt is able to feed not only its own population, but also travelers come from nearby countries such as Israel to gain access to that food. Another is, again, Joseph. This is in chapter 43 of Genesis, where he feeds his brothers. He has 11 brothers, and one of them is Benjamin. Benjamin is only his full, true brother. Both Benjamin and Joseph were born from Rachel and Jacob. The others were from Leah, Rachel's sisters. So he has 10 half-brothers and then Benjamin. When they come with Benjamin, Joseph treats them with such respect and dignity and gives them a beautiful blessing and a beautiful meal. And actually he gives Benjamin a portion that is 5 times greater than what he gives to the other ones. So he really has an affinity for Benjamin. The next ones are in Exodus, where God is preparing the Passover. The people of Israel are in Egypt many, many years as they were brought to Egypt as a result of Joseph's strength in that land. But they are requested to provide a male lamb. And it could be, a sheep or a goat, but basically what the Lord had requested was that on the doorpost and the lintel, the blood of that lamb be shown so that that particular house would have Israelites that would be passed over. Then I mentioned the final one, and that is in Exodus again, where the Lord provides manna. The Israelites are complaining like, we don't have food. In Egypt, we were doing very, very well. Here we are, and, we're starving. So the Lord arranges manna to be provided every day in the morning, and then the ability to have quail, a meat source, in the afternoon. And then what he does, the Lord provides them a double meal on Friday, for not only Friday, but also for the Sabbath day on Saturday. So it's a double portion. So those are examples, beautiful examples of food in the very early books of the Old Testament. The time of eating is interesting. Only 2 meals a day were generally eaten. The laborer worked until midday before taking his first meal. The noon meal was generally not important, usually consisting of bread, olives, and sometimes fruit. The chief meal of the day, and perhaps the only one for the very poor, was served in the early evening, an hour or two before sunset, when the duties of the day were over. It was then a time of rest, refreshment, and family reunion. After the meal, for an hour or two before bedtime, the men sat around and talked. The place of eating, generally at family meals, in the earliest of times, the Hebrews usually sat on the ground on mats to eat. Men and women ate together, except at more formal gatherings. Later, the Hebrews adopted the Canaanite practice of sitting on chairs or stools and eating from small leather stands. Ordinary homes did not have a room just for dining. At mealtime, a broad circular mat or low tables were placed on the floor within reach of all who would dip from the common dish. Larger homes had dining rooms with one side open to the street, with adjustable curtains. Passers-by stopped to look to see who was being entertained and even talked with the guests. The tables was a three-sided piece of furniture with open space left for servants to serve the meal. Guests reclined on couches. The wealthy homes had large dining halls. By the way, this information is from a website called the Encyclopedia of the Bible Gateway, so it has interesting topics. Abraham, as I mentioned, served his guests, those angels, outdoors. Gideon served an angel under a tree. Shepherds and laborers ate their meals where they worked. The disciples of Jesus picked ripe grain and ate it one Sabbath as they passed through the fields. Jesus fed the multitude on a hillside and his disciples on a beach after his resurrection. The food that was served is generally bread and water, were the mainstay of the common people. Meat was a luxury seldom enjoyed by the poor. The wild game was available. Meat from specially fattened animals was saved for very special occasions. A lamb sometimes was roasted entirely. Fish was an abundant source of meat. Eggs were available. Milk, particularly of the goat and camel, was served fresh or made into a curds and whey form. Butter and olive oil were important foods. Melons were popular. Vegetables were an important part of the diet. Beans, lentils, and peas were made into a pottage or a soup or a stew. Fresh fruits were eaten in season. Figs, raisins, walnuts, almonds were the commonest dried fruits. Relishes, consisting of onions, leeks, garlic, and lettuce. Seasonings, salt and spices, and sweets, usually honey and dates, were greatly desired by the Israelites. The harvesters' fare consisted of bread dipped in vinegar and parched grain. The shepherd carried with him a meal of bread, sometimes fruit and cheese, which he ate at noon while the sheep rested. A soldier's ration consisted of parched grain, bread, and cheese. A wayfarer? Wayfarers often had difficulty finding food. Quail and manna were provided by God in answer to the complaints of the hungry Israelites. Hagar, she was the concubine of Abraham, and her son Ishmael were sent into the wilderness with only bread and a little bit of water. Elijah was fed by the ravens. Caravan drivers were careful to take generous amounts of food with them, consisting of dried fruits, bread, olives, and cheese. A nomadic code of hospitality developed in the ancient Near East so that a sojourner coming to a stranger's home was assured of food, shelter, and protection from enemies who might be pursuing him. His host knew that one day he might be obligated to ask for similar shelter. Inns for travelers were a much older institution than most people realize. though usually only the well-to-do trader or traveler could afford them. The brothers of Joseph stopped at an inn on the way home from Egypt. Moses and his family stopped at a lodging place on the way back to Egypt. The innkeeper was not subject to the nomadic laws of hospitality, for he required payment for his food and lodging. In blessings, after the guests were seated, servants passed among them to wash their hands. Afterward, the host offered a blessing for the food. Jesus gave thanks when he fed the multitude. He gave thanks at the Lord's Supper. He blessed the meal with the Emmaus disciples. As a tradition, the early Christians blessed their meals. Guests usually were served by the woman of the household or by servants in the wealthier homes. Forks and other utensils were not used. Guests ate with their fingers. Cups and goblets were provided for drinking wine. As a special act of respect, the master of the house sometimes personally attended his guests. The guest of honor received the choicest and largest portions of food. As an assurance of friendly regard, the host himself would dip a piece of bread in the common dish and hand it to another at the table. Crumbs were thrown under the table. Banquets and feasts were often accompanied by music, by singing, by dancing, by the asking of riddles. In New Testament times, for Greek banquets were aesthetic and intellectual gatherings. After eating, the assembled guests talked far into the night on philosophy and politics. The Hebrews had a number of dietary laws which forbade the eating of certain animals called unclean. The Pharisees would not eat without washing their hands. In New Testament times, the Jews did not approve of eating with Gentiles or sinners. Moderation in diet was encouraged. In the New Testament, Christians were not to reject anything as common which God has made. Excesses were condemned. Jesus said that the food was not the most important thing in life. Christians were not to ask any questions about food set before them at feasts. So I want to thank you for listening. It's a little bit different subject, but one that's quite interesting. So until the next time, thank you very much and farewell.